Wacko Jacko. Where'd that come from? The interviewer expected a joke. Instead, Michael Jackson looked straight at him and said something that instantly changed the mood. I have a heart and I have feelings. When you do that to me, it's not nice. Don't do it. For a moment, nobody knew how to respond. And that wasn't the first time it happened. For decades, interviewers tried to corner Michael Jackson on live television. They asked invasive questions, repeated tabloid rumors, and pushed boundaries that most celebrities would never tolerate. The strange part? The harder they pushed, the worse they often made themselves look. Again and again, interviewers walked into conversations believing they controlled the room. Then Michael answered, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with a single sentence, and sometimes with a response so calm that it completely flipped the conversation against the person asking the question. From Oprah Winfrey to Diane Sawyer, from Barbara Walters to Martin Bashir, some of television's biggest names thought they had Michael Jackson backed into a corner. What happened instead is why these interviews are still being watched decades later. And the first example came during an interview so big that more than 60 million people tuned in to watch. What started as a simple conversation quickly turned into one of the most uncomfortable moments of Oprah Winfrey's career. The first example happened in 1993. At the time, Michael Jackson had not given a major live television interview in more than 14 years. The anticipation was enormous. Millions of viewers tuned in to watch, and Oprah Winfrey had secured what many considered the biggest celebrity interview of the decade. Everyone wanted answers, not just about Michael's music, about Michael himself. For years, rumors had surrounded nearly every aspect of his life. The public wanted to know who he really was behind the headlines, and Oprah wasn't interested in asking only safe questions. From the very beginning, the interview felt different. The conversation quickly moved away from albums and performances and into Michael's private life. Did he date? Was he in love? Did he ever want a family? At first, Michael seemed comfortable. He laughed. He smiled. He answered politely. But then Oprah asked a question that immediately changed the atmosphere. Even today, it's difficult to imagine a celebrity being asked something this personal on live television. I'm going to ask you this, Oprah said. It's embarrassing for me to ask you, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Are you a virgin? For a second, the room froze. This was exactly the kind of moment that creates headlines. Most celebrities would have reacted emotionally. Some would have refused to answer. Others would have become defensive. Michael did neither. Instead, he smiled. How could you ask me that question? He replied. The audience burst into laughter. But Michael wasn't finished. I'm a gentleman. It was a simple answer. Yet it completely changed the dynamic of the conversation. Because suddenly, Michael wasn't the uncomfortable person in the room anymore. Oprah was. She tried to push forward. So you're not going to answer it? Michael smiled again. I'm embarrassed. Once more, the audience laughed. And just like that, one of the most invasive questions of the interview had backfired. What makes this moment so interesting isn't that Michael avoided the question. It's how he avoided it. He didn't get angry. He didn't attack Oprah. He didn't create a scene. Instead, he made the audience see the question differently. In less than a minute, the conversation stopped being about Michael's private life and became about whether the question should have been asked at all. That ability would appear again and again throughout his career. The harder interviewers pushed, the calmer Michael often became. And Oprah was about to discover that for herself. Because the most controversial question of the entire interview was still ahead. A question about Michael's appearance. A question that had fueled years of tabloid headlines. And unlike the previous exchange, this wasn't something Michael could simply laugh away. If Oprah's question about Michael's private life was uncomfortable, what came next was far more serious. Because by 1993, there was one rumor that seemed impossible for Michael Jackson to escape: his skin. For years, newspapers, magazines, and television programs had obsessed over his appearance. The speculation had become so widespread that many people accepted it as fact. Some claimed Michael was bleaching his skin. Others claimed he was trying to change his race. And by the time he sat down with Oprah, millions of people were waiting to hear his answer. Then Oprah asked the question directly. "Are you bleaching your skin?" The question wasn't surprising. What was surprising was how calmly Michael responded. "Number one," he began, "there is no such thing as skin bleaching as far as I know." Then he explained that he suffered from a skin disorder that affected the pigmentation of his skin. But the most powerful moment wasn't the explanation. It was what happened next. Because instead of simply defending himself, Michael challenged the logic behind the accusation. "What about all the millions of people who sit out in the sun to become darker?" he asked. "Nobody says anything about that." For a moment, the entire conversation shifted. The question was supposed to put Michael on the defensive. Instead, Michael had forced everyone to examine the assumption behind the question itself. And that mattered, because this wasn't just another celebrity rumor. To Michael, it was personal, very personal. "When people make up stories that I don't want to be who I am," he said, "it hurts me." Suddenly, the discussion wasn't about tabloids anymore. It wasn't about gossip. It wasn't even about appearance. It was about identity. For years, strangers had debated Michael's body, his face, and his skin color as though he wasn't part of the conversation. Now they were hearing directly from the person at the center of it. And unlike the headlines, Michael didn't sound angry. He sounded hurt. That may have been the most unexpected part of the entire exchange. People expected outrage. What they got was honesty. But Oprah wasn't finished. Because there was another rumor that had followed Michael for years: plastic surgery. By this point, stories about Michael's face had become a permanent part of celebrity news coverage. Every new photograph generated fresh speculation. Every public appearance sparked new headlines. So Oprah asked him directly, how much plastic surgery had he actually had? The audience leaned in. Michael smiled. "Very, very little." Then he added something that immediately changed the mood. "You can count them on 2 fingers." The audience laughed. Even Oprah laughed. And just like that, another potentially hostile moment lost its power. But Michael wasn't done, because he followed the joke with a line that completely flipped the conversation. "If all the people in Hollywood who had plastic surgery went on vacation," he said, "there wouldn't be a person left in town." The audience laughed again. And that's what made Michael so difficult to corner. Every time a question seemed designed to make him uncomfortable, he found a way to make the question itself look unreasonable. Not through anger, not through confrontation, but through calm. The interviewer expected a defensive celebrity. Instead, they got someone who understood exactly how the game was being played. And soon, Michael would face a different kind of attack. One that had nothing to do with his appearance. A nickname that millions of people repeated for years without thinking twice. A nickname Michael Jackson absolutely hated. And when he was finally asked about it on camera, his response left the interviewer with nowhere to go. By the mid-1990s, Michael Jackson wasn't just dealing with rumors. He was dealing with something far more damaging. A public image that other people had created for him. And no nickname represented that better than 2 words he absolutely hated. Wacko Jacko. For years, tabloids used it constantly. Newspapers printed it. Television hosts repeated it. Radio personalities joked about it. Eventually, millions of people started saying it without ever stopping to think where it came from. Then one interviewer decided to ask Michael about it directly. "Wacko Jacko, where'd that come from?" The question sounded harmless, maybe even funny. But Michael's reaction immediately changed the atmosphere. Some English tabloid. Short, direct. No smile. No joke. Just an answer. Then came the moment that completely shifted the conversation. "I have a heart and I have feelings." Michael paused. "I feel that when you do that to me, it's not nice. Don't do it." Suddenly, nobody was laughing anymore. And that's what made the exchange so powerful. For years, people had treated the nickname like a joke. In less than 10 seconds, Michael made them see it differently. Because once you hear someone calmly explain that a nickname hurts them, it stops sounding funny, starts sounding cruel. The interviewer had expected a light-hearted conversation. Instead, Michael turned the spotlight right back around. Without raising his voice, without attacking anyone, without losing control. And that was becoming a pattern. The more personal the question became, the more carefully Michael chose his words. The more disrespectful the assumption, the calmer his response seemed to be. But not everyone was convinced. Some interviewers argued that Michael brought the attention on himself. After all, they said, he dressed differently. He lived differently. He created Neverland. Didn't that naturally attract publicity? Most celebrities would have become defensive. Michael didn't. There's no mysterious behavior, he said. Then he explained something surprisingly simple. There are moments when he performs for millions of people. And there are moments when he wants to be left alone, to relax, to sleep, to live like everyone else. The answer wasn't dramatic. That was exactly why it worked. Because for years, the media had portrayed Michael as someone completely disconnected from normal life. Yet his explanation was something almost everyone could relate to. Privacy, personal space, the ability to exist without cameras following you everywhere. Then Michael delivered one of the strongest points of the entire interview. When the discussion turned to paparazzi attention, he brought up a name that instantly changed the mood. Princess Diana. The room grew noticeably more serious, because unlike celebrity gossip, this wasn't a joke. This was a real example of what can happen when public curiosity turns into obsession. Michael's point was simple. Fame shouldn't eliminate someone's humanity. Being famous shouldn't mean surrendering every private moment. And being a public figure shouldn't make you public property. For a moment, the interviewer wasn't leading the conversation anymore. Michael was. And that may be why so many of these clips still resonate today. Not because Michael delivered some devastating comeback, but because he quietly exposed something many people had never considered. The difference between reporting on someone and treating them like entertainment. Unfortunately, the questions Michael faced were about to become much more serious, because the next interviews wouldn't focus on nicknames, privacy, or tabloids. They would focus on allegations. And what followed would turn some of the biggest television interviews of Michael Jackson's life into something that felt less like journalism and more like a public trial. By 1995, Michael Jackson wasn't walking into interviews anymore. He was walking into courtrooms disguised as television studios. At least that's what it felt like. The media storm surrounding him had become so intense that every appearance carried enormous pressure. Every answer was analyzed. Every pause was interpreted. Every expression became a headline. And nowhere was that more obvious than during the highly anticipated interview with Diane Sawyer. More than anything else, viewers wanted answers. Not about music. Not about performances. About the allegations that had dominated headlines around the world. From the moment the interview began, the atmosphere felt different. This wasn't a celebrity profile. It wasn't a friendly conversation. It felt like an interrogation. Sitting beside Michael was Lisa Marie Presley. And even before the hardest questions arrived, Sawyer began testing their relationship. How did they meet? Was the marriage real? Could it survive the controversy surrounding Michael? The questions kept coming. But then the interview moved into far more serious territory. And suddenly, millions of viewers found themselves watching one of the most uncomfortable moments of Michael's career. Sawyer asked the question directly. Did you ever sexually engage with a child? There was no hesitation. Never. Ever. 3 words. That was it. No long explanation. No attempt to dodge the question. No carefully crafted speech. Just a direct answer. And for a moment, the momentum of the interview stopped. Because many people expected Michael to panic. Instead, he remained completely composed. Sawyer pressed further. Michael answered. She pushed again. Michael answered again. The pattern repeated itself throughout the interview. What made the exchange fascinating wasn't necessarily what Michael said. It was how he said it. The pressure kept increasing. His demeanor barely changed. Most people, when accused of something this serious on national television, would show visible frustration. Michael seemed determined not to give the cameras that moment. Again and again, he pulled the conversation back to facts. Again and again, he challenged assumptions. Again and again, he refused to let emotion take control of the interview. And that's where something unexpected happened. The longer the questioning continued, the more viewers started paying attention to the interview itself. Not just the answers, the questions, the tone, the atmosphere, the way the conversation was being conducted. Because at certain points, it felt less like a journalist searching for information and more like a prosecutor building a case. Michael appeared to recognize that. Instead of fighting the interviewer, he focused on surviving the process. And that may have been his greatest strength. He understood that the interview wasn't really about winning. It was about not losing control. Because the second he became angry, the second he exploded, the second he gave the media the dramatic reaction they wanted, the story would no longer be the allegations. The story would become Michael Jackson's reaction. So he refused to give them that moment. And that decision changed the entire dynamic of the interview. The pressure was supposed to break him. Instead, it highlighted how much pressure he was under. But if Diane Sawyer's interview felt intense, what happened next would be even more damaging. Because the next journalist wouldn't spend a few hours with Michael. He would spend months with him. He would gain unprecedented access to Michael's private world. He would earn Michael's trust. And according to Michael, he would eventually betray it. His name was Martin Bashir. And the interview that followed would become one of the most controversial chapters of Michael Jackson's entire life. If Diane Sawyer's interview felt like a public trial, what happened with Martin Bashir felt far more personal. Because this time, Michael Jackson wasn't sitting across from a journalist for an hour. He was inviting one into his life. In the early 2000s, British journalist Martin Bashir was given something most reporters could only dream of. Access. Real access. For months, cameras followed Michael around the world. Inside Neverland. On private trips. Behind the scenes of his daily life. The documentary was promoted as an opportunity for viewers to finally see the real Michael Jackson. And at first, that's exactly what it looked like. Michael appeared unusually open. He spoke about his childhood, his loneliness, his love for helping children, the challenges of growing up in front of the entire world. More than anything, he seemed to trust Bashir. That trust would become the story. Because when the documentary finally aired, many viewers felt they weren't watching a portrait of Michael Jackson. They were watching a prosecution. Almost immediately, headlines exploded. News channels replayed the same clips. Talk shows debated the same moments. And once again, Michael Jackson found himself at the center of a global controversy. The most famous moment involved Michael discussing children at Neverland. Bashir focused heavily on Michael's comments about sharing his bedroom with children. The clip spread everywhere. For critics, it became evidence. For supporters, it became proof that the documentary had been structured around controversy from the very beginning. And that's where things started getting interesting. Because Michael wasn't just upset by the reaction. He was upset by Bashir himself. According to Michael, the journalist he believed he was helping had presented a completely different story from the one he thought they were making together. In Michael's view, positive moments had been removed, context had disappeared, and the most controversial material had been placed front and center. Whether viewers agreed with him or not, one thing became clear. The relationship between Michael and the media had reached a breaking point. Then came a moment that many people overlook. After the documentary aired, Michael pushed back publicly. And suddenly, the confident journalist who had spent months questioning Michael found himself facing questions of his own. People wanted to know how the documentary had been edited. What had been left out? What had been emphasized? Why did certain moments dominate the final version while others barely appeared at all? For perhaps the first time in the entire story, the spotlight wasn't focused entirely on Michael Jackson. It was focused on the interviewer. And that was a pattern we've seen throughout this video. Again and again, interviewers believed they controlled the narrative. Then something unexpected happened. Michael stayed calm. He answered. He waited. And eventually, attention shifted back toward the people asking the questions. That doesn't mean Michael won every public debate. Far from it. But it does explain why so many of these interviews remain fascinating decades later. Because underneath every confrontation was the same struggle. Who controlled the story? The journalist? The headlines? Or the person living through it? By this point, Michael had spent decades trying to answer that question. And in the final chapter of this story, we'll look at the one quality that allowed him to survive interviews that would have overwhelmed most celebrities. Because his greatest weapon was never his fame. It wasn't his success. And it certainly wasn't his ability to perform. It was something much simpler than that. Looking back at all of these interviews, a pattern starts to emerge. It didn't matter whether the interviewer was Oprah Winfrey, Diane Sawyer, Barbara Walters, or Martin Bashir. The strategy was often the same. Push harder. Ask more personal questions. Create a dramatic moment. Wait for Michael Jackson to crack. And yet, that moment almost never came. That's what made Michael so difficult to interview. Most people assume you win an argument by talking louder. Michael often did the opposite. The more pressure he faced, the calmer he became. The more aggressive the questioning, the more careful his answers became. And over time, something interesting started happening. The interviews stopped revealing Michael Jackson. They started revealing the people interviewing him. Think about the moments we've looked at. The virgin question, the skin-bleaching accusations, the Wacko Jacko nickname, the relentless questions about his private life, the confrontational interviews, the Martin Bashir controversy. In almost every case, the interviewer believed they were putting Michael on trial. But years later, many viewers remember something completely different. They remember how Michael handled it. Because while interviewers were searching for a headline, Michael was often exposing something far more uncomfortable. The assumptions behind the question itself. That's why so many of these clips continue to circulate online decades later. Not because Michael delivered savage one-liners. Not because he humiliated people with insults. But because he made something much harder look effortless. He made people question the question. And once that happened, the entire conversation changed. The interviewer was no longer in control. The audience was no longer focused on Michael's reaction. They were focused on the person asking the question. That was Michael's real advantage. He understood something many celebrities never learn. You don't always win by fighting back. Sometimes you win by refusing to play the game at all. And whether you loved Michael Jackson, disliked him, or remained undecided about him, that's exactly what makes these interviews so fascinating to watch today. Because the more the cameras searched for a breakdown, the more they captured a man determined not to give them one. And in the end, that may have been the most frustrating thing of all for the people trying to corner him. They came looking for a spectacle. Instead, they got composure. And decades later, that's the part people still remember. If you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments which interview moment surprised you the most. And if you'd like to see more stories about legendary celebrity interviews, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a future upload.